Once, we traveled the stars. We saw things that brought us joy. We made discoveries that kept us hungry for more. But some of those discoveries were hungry for us. They were forever feeding but never satisfied. So we descended into deep bunkers, saying farewell to the open sky. And over quiet centuries, we forgot so many things. But we returned. We reignited our old hunger to discover and rebuilt what was lost. But the insatiable hunger also returned. It felt hopeless to be pursued by such creatures. Until the day one stopped and observed us, like we once observed them. We were sick of hiding, so a brave few followed their curiosity. What wonders lie beyond these stars?
Hey people, Voice talking to you, and today we're checking out a new title called Beyond These Stars. This is a city builder / colony survival strategy game set on the back of a giant intergalactic space whale. If living on the back of an interstellar leviathan sounds like your idea of a vacation, I'll have a link for you down in the description where you can download the demo for this game and try it out for yourself. There's also a link down there to my Twitch stream in case you'd like to hang out with us when we test out new games live. Now, the backstory of Beyond These Stars might be a bit darker than you were expecting, considering the cutesy graphics. We are the Peeps, a once sprawling human empire with settled worlds all across the stars. That was, of course, until titanic, spacefaring leviathans began devouring these worlds and everyone who lived there. As a last-ditch effort, our planet retreated to shelters deep underground. I don't really know how this would save us if our planet was swallowed, but maybe these monstrous creatures are only interested in planets that are clearly inhabited? Regardless, life in bunkers wasn't sustainable, and eventually our peeps were forced to resettle the surface. Before long, a particular space whale arrived, but instead of devouring the planet, it simply observed. Some wanted to flee the planet, but a brave, morbidly curious few decided that this opportunity shouldn't be wasted. These peeps are our crew, and they soon took off in a shuttle to land on the creature's back and see what could be learned from it. This is where our story begins, as our crew disembarks onto a blooming, fertile landscape entirely on the back of this enormous space whale. Apparently, this thing is big and dense enough not only to have its own gravity and a few small moons, but also to maintain its own atmosphere, and a breathable one at that. The next step is to construct a livable outpost on the whale's back that can serve as a base for studying the creature. Before we jump right into the building, though, let me briefly explain the landscape. The whale's back is composed of interconnected hex tiles, each with its own conditions, fertility levels, material composition, height, and oxygen levels. This hex grid looks and functions a lot like a strategy game board, and it's important to consider the location and terrain of a hex before choosing to build there. For example, you wouldn't want to accidentally block off your access to a mineral vein, and planting farms on dead soil is a pointless venture. If you want to make the terrain work for you, however, there are a couple of ways to change it around to better suit your needs. The presence of living trees is the requirement for atmosphere, so redirecting water to reach barren zones can make them breathable and fertile, sort of like in Timberborn. This, and many other adjustments to the terrain, can be accomplished with a terraformer, but will take time and resources. Since this is a city builder, managing resources is, of course, part of the challenge. Players will need basic materials like wood, iron, and stone to get started, but will eventually be able to utilize advanced resources like steel, planks, and glass. You'll also need enough food and water coming in to keep your peeps properly fed, as well as homes to live in and somewhere for them to relax, since our plucky crew didn't seem to account for the fact that living on the back of one of the creatures that ate their civilization would cause these peeps a bit of existential dread. Plus, not long after we arrive on the whale, it starts moving, opening or diving into some kind of wormhole and goes hurtling across space at warp speed, whisking our entire group who knows how far from home, with their only lifeboat being a planet-eating cetacean. Oh, and I guess they also don't like working. Different jobs will decrease happiness at different rates, as working in woodcutting tends to be a bit more pleasant than working in a dump, at least in this universe. And if your peeps get too unhappy, they'll stop working. Speaking of dumps, another factor we'll need to manage is pollution. Factories, smelters, and the like produce airborne pollution that is not only harmful to the space whale, but also makes living in a polluted space unpleasant. Additionally, your production centers will also create byproducts such as slag, ash, and wood waste that will need to be dealt with. There will likely be ways to make use of each of these products in some way, but in the demo we can only use wood waste as fuel for burner generators. The rest will either take up space in your warehouses or require a dump where they can be deposited. Now that's already a decent sized load to manage, but you'll also need to take into account that each building can gain certain benefits or debuffs from being next to other buildings or terrain of a certain kind. For example, potato patches grow faster when planted next to water, and they can gain additional benefits when one is placed next to 4 others. However, placing an agricultural structure next to a water pump can cause some problems, since the pump will likely decrease the water level in the soil. Likewise, placing a house next to a factory can increase production speed of that factory, but the ambient pollution is likely to make the resident of that house rather unhappy. Balancing these adjacency bonuses with potential issues is a big chunk of the strategy when it comes to planning out your city. I'll admit, I struggled with the system quite a bit at first, but I feel this was more my issue than the game's. First off, I'm more accustomed to a square grid system rather than hexes, and secondly, I was too much of a perfectionist when it comes to trying to trigger bonuses. It's important to understand that there isn't a way to trigger every bonus for every building. In fact, some buildings you'll end up placing just to trigger a bonus for an adjacent building. Since everything also has to be connected to a road, chances are your city's gonna end up looking pretty topsy-turvy at the end of the day. That said, once you figure out how the system works and start to get a feel for road placement and preferred layouts, it actually becomes quite a satisfying process, especially when everything lines up just the way you want it to. It's also nice once in a while to watch your little peeps meandering around, carrying boxes and talking to each other. They speak in a made-up language, but a speech bubble over their head will translate their thoughts for you. Admittedly, most of what they're thinking is pretty doom and gloom, but I imagine there will be more variety to that in the final version. Speaking of variety, there isn't much variety to the building models, so every building of the same type will look exactly the same. Now that's not necessarily a deal breaker, but moving little details like chimneys, windows, and doors around can make the aesthetic quality of your world significantly better. Aside from that though, the visuals of this game are pretty stellar, pardon the pun. The space whale is a bit blocky looking, but the landscape is diverse, the animations are solid, and the building models are detailed. And space itself is a marvel to behold. Whoa! Oh, that was cool. The music is also a fantastic ambient mix of slow, dreamy tunes and dramatic, inspiring atmospherics. From an artistic point of view, I couldn't find many faults in this title, and was largely impressed with its catchy style. I would like to be able to zoom out and see the whole whale, and I'd like a bit more variety in terrain types and, as I mentioned, building models, but overall, Beyond These Stars is very easy to look at. Gameplay-wise, the puzzle and strategy of planning out your city, making use of natural resources, terraforming, and deciding what warehouses store what is a satisfying and involved experience. Keeping peeps happy and healthy is a challenge, and will require some trial and error to get it right. However, I didn't really feel much pressure or opposition overall. To clarify, I'm not saying the game necessarily needs to have time constraints on the player or be more difficult, but I was a very poor leader at first, and the only negative consequences I had for letting my peeps live in squalor was slower work. The potential for my peeps to become sick from pollution or stress is a good example of what I would recommend to add another layer of risk to the mix without making the game less chill overall. Additionally, there are some ways to get around storing materials and disposing of waste, like deconstructing and reconstructing the building storing it to dump it on the ground. There doesn't seem to be a downside to this other than being unable to remove a road with resources sitting on it. The overall UI could also do with a few quality of life improvements, such as displaying the current allocated storage for a certain resource and making many more of the resource numbers visible. It is possible to enable these counters, but a simple vertical display along the side of the screen in a small font, kind of like how RimWorld does it, would be my suggestion. And in terms of tutorialization, I would strongly recommend that they talk about the adjacency bonuses first and foremost, because they wait quite a while until you've already placed probably half of your basic buildings before they tell you that adjacency bonuses even exist, and at that point you're like, oh, now I have to break everything down and put it back somewhere it's more effective. A lot of the mechanics like pollution are also kind of unclear in how they affect gameplay. I know pollution is probably going to impact the whale at some point, and I know peeps don't like it, but there isn't any clear indication of the radius of a building's ambient pollution or any kind of metric telling you how much pollution it will produce over time, so there's no real way to plan for it. Now, the last mechanic the game introduces is also the most interesting and reminds me a lot of the Wandering Village. At the end of the demo, we finally construct a transmitter in the strange alien ruin we find buried in the whale's back. With this, we begin receiving signals that turn out to be from the whale, meaning this creature isn't just sentient, but also intelligent enough to hold a conversation. Their name is Kiwa, and they're an extremely old and weak space whale nearing the end of its life. Whether that might take months or centuries, I have no idea. But what's important is that Kiwa can't take us back home just yet, as it fled in a panic when we arrived and lacks the energy and direction. What we can do, however, is direct Kiwa to travel to different star systems to search for other surviving peep worlds who might be able to help us. Now the demo ends here, but the devs promise a lot more content with this feature. Trade with alien civilizations, quests, and different effects from traveling through space. For example, passing through cold, empty space for too long can be harmful to both the whale and our peeps, so staying near stars is the safest option. Now, if that all turns out to be true, and these mechanics are implemented in interesting ways, Beyond These Stars could be a really awesome genre-bending colony sim. But, to be fair, none of these mechanics were present in the demo, so you'll have to take the dev's word for it. And there were several points during the demo where there just wasn't much for me to do. But I'm just the voice in your head, so let me know what you think about this game. Does this remind you of any other games? What are your thoughts on the whole space leviathan apocalypse? Let's talk about it down in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, leaving a like helps me out a ton, and if you enjoy this kind of content, subscribing is the best way to get more. Thanks so much for listening to me today, and you'll be hearing from me again real soon.